All right, so welcome to class. We're looking at Frida Kahlo. You can see the years of her life there between 1907, 1954. Um, not a very long life. In fact, she's about my age when she died, and yet her life was very fruitful, and yet also filled with a lot of suffering. And that suffering was the source of her creativity. And I don't just mean her own physical suffering, which was incredible, but also personal suffering, romantic suffering, because she married a guy who cheated on her a lot. But she got her vengeance on him by making his infidelity kind of a major subject of her painting. So good for her. And we'll see that today. And kind of a little bit to cover. So let's go ahead and get started because I'm going to try to condense it all into this lecture. So Frida Kahlo is definitely, her story is a story in part about Mexico, but also about the 20th century. And remember, we saw this painting of her splitting herself into two pieces. And she did this as a way to reflect on her divided nature between the European ancestry and the indigenous Mexican ancestry. If you recall, uh, being indigenous into Mexico is sort of like slavery to the United States. It's Mexico's internal struggle is to overcome the discrimination and racism towards indigenous people in Mexico. And, a similar example might be overcoming the stain of slavery in the United States. And I think her work like this speaks to a lot of people in the New World, particularly because we all have to find our own sense of identity, whether it's affirming our a European, African, Asian, Latin identity, or affirming a kind of modern identity. And I think she deals with this conflict through painting. And this is a very wonderful example of her work reaching this level of skill and quality by 1937. But the decade prior to that, really, we see her evolve and develop into the person that she is here, turning her skill into tackling subjects that are both very personal and I think very universal. This is also something that addresses her deteriorating relationship with her husband, Diego Rivera, who is a very famous painter whose work we'll look at a little bit today and probably another day. So here he is with her. This is a painting she does in 1931, very much kind of the doting wife. And then on the other side, you can see in 1941 what a transformation takes place. You don't see her husband anymore. She's definitely doesn't look like the doting wife anymore. And her painting quality has really improved quite a bit. So, like I said earlier, her painting is a very powerful form of self-growth and self-control. It's a way of keeping herself together as her body falls apart. So she famously had an accident when she was in her, I think, 19 or early 20s, where a bus crashed into the trolley she was riding on, or a truck crashed into the bus she was riding on, and she ended up with lifelong pain and suffering. A bar penetrated her pelvis and broke her pelvis, and she had it resulted in a lot of time in bed. And that's when her father, who took the photograph here on the left, her father was a very accomplished photographer, a man of German descent. He bought her paintings, easel and paint to paint while she recovered from her injury. A great example of using art to for personal healing and growth. And you can see she's dressed up in drag here on the left, and very much her character is kind of being an outsider, an outlier, very much, and also bisexual. So, in that classic cut of the artist who, lives to marches to their own drum. Frida Kahlo absolutely is the kind of classic artist who lives by her own rules and lives kind of on the edge of normalcy. And here you can see her revisiting this outfit many years later. So one personal reason why she has this outfit on is her older brother died, I think, in childbirth. The mom, I guess the mom lived, but the boy died. So I think one reason why she's wearing this outfit is that was, she's trying to fill the void left by the older brother who died. So that's one explanation for her kind of drag. But also on the right, this is a painting she did after her divorce from her husband. So she's kind of using this masculine outfit as a way to reconcile her relationship with her husband who cheated on her. as many people do after the breakup. They cut off their hair or maybe they change their personal appearance. And so a lot of her work addresses either her personal suffering or her relationship to her very philandering husband. One interesting comparison to Frida Kahlo might be Georgia O'Keeffe. She's an American artist I love very much, and her work has a similar quality without perhaps all the suffering that you see in Frida Kahlo's work. So if you do want to see revisit someone who's similar to Frida Kahlo, I suggest you looking into Georgia O'Keeffe's work. So these are some big themes you see in Frida Kahlo's work. Identity, masquerade means sort of like putting on costumes, playing the role of the wife, playing gender roles, playing sexual roles. But the masquerade refers to the costuming of the roles that we play. And she lived in a time where there's a lot of communism. She herself was a devout communist, a devout atheist, but she still used some of her Catholic culture, and it finds its way into her painting. Some people call her a surrealist, but I think it's more that she was just interested in science. Her father bought her a microscope when she was a child, so she had a lot of interest in science and exploration, and that definitely plays a big part into the subject matter. And she had a lot of self-consciousness because of her injuries, but also she had a shorter leg. She had polio as a child, so a lot of her persona is a mask, a way of masking her own sense of inadequacy. And I think everyone, has to wrestle with that as well. So I think all that makes her very relatable. And of course, in Mexico, her diverse roots, German and mixed roots, make her a really interesting emblem of this transformation of Mexico from the colonial Mexico, into the modern Mexico, where Mexico has to resolve its own internal struggles, particularly over racism against indigenous people. And her story chronicles the transformation of Mexico, particularly the Mexican Revolution, how it finally brought all of Mexico together in a more fair way, dealing with things like unemployment, landlessness, labor unions, government control over natural resources, because the United States wanted all the oil in Mexico, and there was a lot of strain between Mexico and the United States up until the 1920s, when the United States decided to start inviting Mexican artists to the United States to build bridges in anticipation of Hitler conquering Europe and the United States knowing they'd need that oil. So Frida Kahlo definitely is an important figure in Mexican history. Not maybe as well known as the Mexican muralist at the time, because they were the more official representatives of Mexico, but she tagged along with Diego Rivera, her husband, and all the while developed her talents from what you see here at an early young age to her to what you see here, where she really kind of seemed to grow up in like 4 years into a more mature woman. And her painting skills really developed partly because her husband is a really important mentor, and having all that proximity to a really talented artist is a benefit to one's career. So, like I said, in 1925, she has this accident, and this accident would mark her life, the suffering, the healing, and so, you know, painting this accident was something, being able to address it was certainly part of her healing process. Um, but I think also, like I said, her father gave her paint as a way to heal and to have something to do while she's healing. So that's why you see her painting this constellation of people who are around her. Her sister is a big part of her life, both for good and for bad, and other people in Mexico who played a really significant part in her life while she was healing, but also just, Mexico, you have a much richer fabric of human value than you have in the modern country like the United States. So that's really what you're seeing with these early portraits, is her celebrating the people around her. And then she marries Diego Rivera in 1929. She's really smitten with this larger than life famous celebrity artist who had spent most of the time during the Mexican Revolution in France, in Europe, kind of getting away from the violence, and returned to Mexico after the Mexican Revolution, which basically wrapped up around 1920. So it was a 10-year civil war in Mexico, very bloody, and the United States was terrified of this civil war bleeding into the United States. And that's one reason why we wanted to form better neighbors with Mexico, and invited artists like Diego Rivera to come to the United States to paint murals. Now, lurking in the background of all this is this communist revolution, the fear that the arts might become too communist. And so there's an effort to appropriate or take control over the arts, the momentum of the art world, so it doesn't get too political, too left wing, too revolutionary. And I think there's some the validity to that because you don't want a Hitler rising up in the New World. You don't want maybe a Bolshevik revolution. I mean, maybe if you're communist, you do, but there's a lot of reason why the United States was worried about chaos, especially because of Hitler's rise in Europe and also, of course, Stalin and the Soviet Union. So paintings like this are, if you look at the career of Diego Rivera, this feels very much inspired or related to the influence of Diego Rivera on Frida Kahlo, but it's also a bus stop. And so we know she was injured while on a bus. So all these paintings like these seem to address her own personal relationship with trauma. And also, it's a painting of Mexico and showing you I think the fabric of life in Mexico, a nice balanced view of workers and rich people and everyday people and indigenous people all sharing space while they wait for the bus. And here's her husband's work. So the kind of work that he does is much bigger, much more historic, much more public, and her work is much more quiet and personalized and intimate. And the contrast between the two is really wonderful. There are moments when they overlap, but I think her work really benefits from that intimacy, the personal quality. Even this really feels like a really kind of personal, like one-on-one painting versus her husband's paintings, which are really meant for public consumption. Now they do influence each other. So here's Frida Kahlo showing you this guy nurtured, nourished by the roots of some fallen figure. In this case, Diego Rivera's painting shows corn nourished by the dead revolutionaries in the form of Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, who were the big leaders of the Mexican Revolution. And the Mexican Revolution was really just that, a way of rectifying the mistakes of the colonial era, providing land to the landless peasants, the indigenous people, and basically steering the government back to a position of helping everyone rather than just the elite peninsulares or the Criollo elite in Mexico. So her journey begins, her artistic journey, is somewhat underway, but really I think goes full steam ahead when she comes to the United States with Diego Rivera. And this is a painting I think she does to kind of celebrate this moment in time when they're newlyweds, and it does feel kind of like she's still playing that role of the doting wife, but that will transform as time goes on, and you can see the two of them, how them looking on at her work. So they come to the United States in 1930. They start in San Francisco, and while he's making work, she's making her own work. And anyone want to comment on this painting? What do you think this painting is addressing? What do we see on the right side? Anyone know what city that is? Yeah, industrialization versus maybe on the left, which is maybe non-industrialization. What city is that on the right? So that I think is Detroit. So now, if, the irony here is a lot of the car manufacturing in Detroit is now in Mexico. There's a certain irony to that. Um, and also keep in mind, this is Frida Kahlo contemplating the difference between the United States and Mexico. And it is a remarkable difference. Any of you of maybe Central American descent might also be aware of, the real pronounced industrial qualities of the United States versus other countries, depending on the country, of course. And that's not necessarily for good or for worse, it's just the reality. And the or the barrier between Mexico and the United States is more than the, level of industrialization, at least at this time period. It's also a language barrier, cultural barrier, and many other barriers. So she's kind of a fish out of water when she comes to the United States, and these paintings are her making very personal this experience she has with trying to reconcile these two worlds and make sense of them. And she's very critical of the United States for good reason and very supportive for other reasons. For instance, she's very much critical of Henry Ford for his anti-Semitism. He's someone who kind of supported the Nazis industrializing Germany, but she like called him an anti-Semite straight to his face when she met him. The Ford Motor Company would be the company that commissions her husband to make his famous murals in Detroit, which are pretty remarkable. She also calls Americans, she says, Americans have faces like unbaked bread. And I think that's more because she's in a very cold part of Detroit when she says that, and people are, less tan. So it really depends. She came to the United States in a very bad time for the United States. The Great Depression was in full swing, and she saw a lot of people waiting in line for food. And so she really, the timing on her coming to the United States didn't help her appreciation of the United States. But that said, there is still that remarkable contrast between the two. And that's really what you see here, showing the ruins of Mexico, the more rural, if you will, kind of rustic side of Mexico versus the and or natural side of Mexico versus the pollution, the noise, the suffocating quality of New York City, I'm sorry, of Detroit on the right side. And I love her work because she's with her husband, but while he's making these big paintings, she's making these more personalized paintings where she's actually in the painting, kind of almost deliberating between the two sides. And which side, if you could say, does she seem to favor one side versus the other here based on the painting alone? For me, the flag indicates she's choosing Mexico, and just cigarette is I think the negative choice, where she's basically saying the United States is like the cigarette, and she loves Mexico. And here is the United States in the 1930s, 1929 onward, people waiting in line in front of a billboard that seems to suggest just the opposite. So it's sort of like going on Instagram. Everyone's happy and perfect looking and all that, but the reality of real life is much different. So here she is painting. An article wrote about her painting, and it says, "Wife of the master painter, mural painter, gleefully dabbles in works of art." And this is just so funny because she's now probably more famous than her husband. So it's very almost patronizing way of looking at her as kind of a supporting character to her husband. And in fact, it's her as he's painting paintings like these. This is her husband's work in Detroit. She's really developing her work quite a bit and evolving. And it's because of things like having a miscarriage that really brings her subject matter to a whole new level. So while her husband's painting pictures of men working in the car factories, and beautiful paintings of workers, she's painting paintings like this, which are addressing her miscarriage. So very, in your face, intense painting, very personalized. And I think that's why her work is so powerful, because it's really not it's not pandering to the audience so much as really her speaking directly to God or to the equivalent of the universe, her using the canvas as like a primal scream. And this is very, I think a subject matter that most people would find really hard to look at. And yet it's so is birth, so is a lot of things are hard to look at, hard to deal with, miscarriage and all that, but they're still part of life. So yet and I think that's what makes her work so powerful. She gives herself permission to use her painting to help her convalesce, to help her heal in the aftermath of these traumatic moments like a miscarriage. Especially, having a miscarriage for her is not just losing a child, but realizing she might not ever be able to have a child. And if you're, a person and you want to have kids, it's quite a shock to, reach a point where you can't have that which you want. Um, and it also means maybe she might feel inadequate as a wife, not be able to give her husband a baby. But happily, she substitutes painting for child rearing, and she's very clear about that in her diaries about this. That painting became a way of compensating for that lack of having a child. And she also had a lot of pets and puppets and animals and stuffed animals that really you'll see later in her work that clearly are kind of substituting having a child. And in this case, she's reading headlines of a woman who was abused and killed by her husband with like unos cuantos piquetitos, little like knife stabbings, and kind of taking that story of trauma and personalizing it, making it about, making it relatable to her own suffering, and even the bloody thumbprints around the frame. It's very powerful. And, as an artist or as an art historian, I can't overstate how big these paintings are for pushing the boundaries of acceptable subject matter, blending writing and subject matter, filtering journalism into her painting, but doing all of it in a way that's not too self-important at all. It's not trying to wow you. It's just really taking stuff and making it meaningful to her personally, and taking these moments where she adds blood and all. It feels like she's really blending the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain in a wonderful way that you don't see very often in art. And likewise here, she's visualizing her miscarriage in terms of the fetus. The snail represents the slow disintegration of the fetus in her body. And really a powerful way of almost surreal-like imagery to address her personal suffering, this miscarriage. And you can see this bleak backdrop is Detroit. So she, while her husband is in, being the celebrity, enjoying life, she's really suffering and feels alone. And not just the loneliness, but the feeling like she's looking at the rest of her life and imagining it without children. And at this point, she really is missing Mexico and wants to go back to Mexico. But there's this conflict between her husband who wants to stay and the wife who wants to go back. And that continues onward. But I want to briefly point out that even though she's a devout atheist, which is meant to be humorous, no one is devoutly atheist. They don't believe in God. She's still channels her Catholic culture in Mexico into her artwork, and she is doing that here. You might not recognize it even here and here, but these pictures will help you see it. So these are called ex voto paintings, and these are paintings by Mexican artists who are commissioned by Mexican people who go through a traumatic experience. It could be burning down, their house burns down, or maybe a shipwreck, maybe a miscarriage, but some kind of personal trauma. And you hire an artist to paint that trauma, and that helps you heal. It helps you overcome that suffering. So it's a really interesting example of using art to kind of like using music. I think of the blues, like African Americans. The blues originates in African American culture. Some say because of it's a way of expressing pain and suffering as a way to cope with poverty and or racism and or slavery, things like that. And I think all of us have some coping mechanism for suffering, and she gloms onto this painting style as a way to make her own suffering more meaningful, make sense of it. And so here are just a few examples of ex voto paintings in Mexico. Now, you don't really see much, and I forget, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't see any equivalent of this in the United States. I mean, now maybe social media, that might be one form of that, but certainly she's only enriched by having this tradition that she can use. It's just interesting that she's a non-Catholic who's embracing this Catholic form of painting, and redirecting it towards her own suffering, like you see here. So these are really, I think, these take her from being kind of a hobbyist painter or just kind of someone who's makes portraits to, being like you could say proto-feminist to much more contemporary, addressing the body, the suffering. I mean, this is kind of stuff you'd see in contemporary art and not necessarily something back in the 1920s or 30s, with rare exceptions. It is true that people lost children very frequently up until, mid 1900s. So losing a child is even her husband, Diego Rivera, lost two children when he was in Europe. This is many years before he met Frida Kahlo. So that was a very common part of life. And so, in the aftermath of the miscarriage and this feeling of despair living in the United States, she paints paintings like this, and staring down at her feet in the bathtub. It's almost like she's using the water as an empty canvas and allowing her own inner demons or inner thoughts to boil up. Her bisexuality, her parents, her home country, her dress becomes a symbol of her identity. So while her Diego Rivera is painting these famous commissioned murals commissioned by the MoMA in the 1930s, she's painting these much more personalized pictures. And if you ask me personally, I'd say these are a million times more interesting than these, although these are interesting from a historical point of view, but they lack that personal suffering or the personal necessity. She's really making these for herself, whereas Diego Rivera is making these for his sort of public image. And they both are valid. They're just two very different. They're nourished by two different sources. And in the end, for me, I think the longer I look at art, the more I'm interested in stuff that's nourished by a very personal source. Sort of like reading someone's diary. and getting access to someone's diary and reading that versus reading their posts on social media. The posts on social media will be for public consumption, but the diary will be very personal, and that's what I feel like you're seeing with Frida Kahlo's artwork. And you can see the separation between the two of them. And look at how much he's slimmed down on the right. And on the left, she's got this empty ice cream cone, which for me is a great symbol of her just feeling like she is missing something. And the separation between the two speaks to their growing alienation from each other as a couple. As many of you will experience, unfortunately, whether it's a male or female, you might fall in love with someone who's really charismatic and or impressive, but all that charisma and impressiveness also will attract other people, and you might end up with someone who is very is not faithful, and so they both cheated on each other a lot. I do think that her cheating was more of a kind of tit for tat against him, and she really kept wanting him to be faithful, and he never was. And she really struggles with that. And I mean, she knew this about him in the first place, and she definitely comes off as being perhaps a little clingy, but you can understand that given her own personal suffering. So I still tend to feel a lot of sympathy for her. I think she's a very sympathetic character. I think her artwork her way of giving life to these feelings she has about New York City in this case. Her dress is hanging between a toilet bowl and a trophy. There's New York City in the background, and it's a nice view on how she experiences the United States compared to his experience too. We'll look at his work on a later date. But so she eventually does go back to Mexico. She convinces him to go back to Mexico, and this is partly because he has some controversy with a mural that he does in Rockefeller Center in New York City. I don't want to go into that now, but I think when you look at a painting like this, what she's doing, her experience in New York and in the United States affirmed her own sense of Mexican identity, her Mexicanidad. And so I think she's really deliberately trying to say, look, I love my tan skin, my olive skin. I love my unibrow. I love my little mustache. I love all the things that make me Mexican. And I think all of that comes from her being in the United States and using that as experience to kind of affirm her own sense of love and self-love and what she loves about her own uniqueness. And I think that's what you see in a lot of these paintings in the 1930s. And here she is with her husband back in Mexico. Uh, and you can see even her style is much more colorful and expressive. And in many ways, this style she's wearing here is very much to satisfy him. He really loved her indigenous roots. He had some indigenous roots, and her outfit is this ensemble she wears is very much her trying to appeal to him, to please him. And that's why when she eventually cuts off her hair and wears the suit, it's a way of rejecting his influence. And so here they are back in Mexico, and you would think, okay, she convinced him to go back to Mexico. They're finally back in their home country. This is a recipe for them finally healing the wounds that they had, and maybe overcoming the trauma of miscarriage. And maybe he will finally be faithful to her. And he paints this mural here in Mexico, a follow-up to the one we saw earlier. Still, his style doesn't really evolve very much. I think that's to his discredit, whereas her style is very much transforming, and you can see him put Frida Kahlo there in the painting down below. For me, whenever he puts Frida Kahlo in the painting, it's a way for him to apologize for cheating on her, or the kind of scale and scope of his public paintings in Mexico City, which we'll look at another date, but a really remarkable contrast to her very personal, private, intimate works. And you might notice next to Frida Kahlo there, that's not Frida in the red, that's Frida above her. The woman in the red is Frida Kahlo's sister. And like I said earlier, you might think, okay, here they are back in Mexico. They use some of the money they make to build this home. And that part on the left is Diego Rivera's building. The building on the right is Frida Kahlo, and that bridge in between is like the sex bridge. Whenever they want to get together, that's kind of like knock on the door. And it's interesting. Two lovers, two artists with big personalities. I feel like this is a great recipe for a happy relationship because they both have their own separate place, a room of one's own, as it were. And you would think, okay, this is a recipe for them finally coming together and healing their relationship. Nope. Diego Rivera sleeps with Frida Kahlo's sister, Christina, which is, the mother of all insults. And he was using Christina as a model. Now, Christina's marriage had collapsed, so she's sort of rudderless and, in a way, kind of vulnerable. And I think he takes advantage of that. But I think, having read her Frida Kahlo and like numbers of Frida Kahlo biographies, my impression is Diego Rivera might have been doing it to sabotage the relationship, because he was just sort of looking for a reason to estrange himself from Frida Kahlo. But of course, she's not going to just put up with it without some kind of response. Here's Christina. And you think about him hooking up with her sister. Her sister has children. That must add all the more insult to the agony. And so Frida Kahlo paints these paintings in 1930s in direct response to Diego Rivera cheating on her, but also envisioning all of her suffering as kind of a collection of different arrows that are coming from different directions. And one arrow might be Diego Rivera, one arrow might be her own personal suffering, one arrow might be the miscarriage, and she's clearly using painting to help her get through this dark period in her life, revisiting her roots, her family. If you think about after a breakup, you go revisit old friends, or maybe you go talk to your family, maybe you change your hairstyle. In this case, it looks like she's affirming her familial roots and affirming her home where she grew up. Like I said, she substitutes puppets and animals and pets and other things for not having a child. Here is a photographic form of her. This is when she's, finally kind of gaining some notoriety for her own artwork and letting her hair down. These are all kind of responses to her husband cheating on her. Now she's rejecting that outfit that really was meant to pander to him, to please him, and she's clearly going through some kind of evolution now, soul searching. She's perforated her heart. She's stuck in between these two worlds, a child identity when she met Diego Rivera, her dress that she wore to please him, and then she's standing at another frontier, much more of a personal, internal frontier rather than at the border with the United States. Now she's kind of in this impersonalized border, and it's really her heart that she's addressing her own sense of, well, should she stay with this guy who cheated on her with her sister? And that's why I think she paints this picture, oddly enough, because you would think, why would she want to paint this guy who cheated on her? Well, I think what she's doing is she's taking an inventory. She's saying, well, what do I like about this guy? And that's what's going on here, I think. That's my own take on it. And you would think, well, how does she get her vengeance on her husband? Well, she hooks up with the famous Soviet leader, the one who goes into exile because Joseph Stalin saw him as a competitor. So she hooks up with Leon Trotsky while Trotsky's staying at her home with Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera welcomed Trotsky because he's a card-carrying communist and is showing solidarity with this communist in exile. And Frida Kahlo seizes on the opportunity to sleep with Leon Trotsky as a way to get back at Diego Rivera for cheating on her with her sister. The real victim here, of course, is Leon Trotsky's wife, who's there in the middle. And here you can see, I think Frida Kahlo is very much projecting that sense of I'm getting back at my husband. And she gives this painting to Leon Trotsky, um, again, I think as a big FU to her husband for cheating on her. And these paintings from this period are really, in one part, her continuing on her own sort of personal journey. Now you can see this painting in context, but also related to, of course, her deteriorating relationship with Diego Rivera. He's actually inside of that oval shape that the woman on the right is holding, the Frida Kahlo on the right is holding in her hand. And I think that torment, that this kind of unflinching look right at you, the viewer, is very much, again, her refining her abilities, her developing a real profound sense of self-confidence with her painting, but also affirming that sense of suffering and how she's really using the canvas as a way to keep herself together. Her spine continued to deteriorate. She felt constant pain from her shorter leg, and she had trouble walking. And so this painting, I think, really captures all these things we were talking about, the suffering and the pain. Um, And I think briefly I'll look at Frida Kahlo again on another day, but in the interest of time, I don't want to go too far, except to point out that I think her work, we're talking about in the 1930s, late 1930s, 40s. Well, what else is going on in the world at this time? Well, this is the time of the rise of Hitler. And I think even though Frida Kahlo is kind of as far from Adolf Hitler as could be, it's very interesting to think about Frida Kahlo's work in contrast to what's going on in Germany. So Frida Kahlo, especially if you think about her, this painting as the culmination of this long journey, is really all about celebrating individuality, affirming your own worth in the face of suffering and maybe not fitting into convention, especially if you think about someone being born and getting polio, having an accident. You're now kind of someone who is not wouldn't be seen as like perfect, right? You're broke. She's literally broken. And if you're in Nazi Germany and you're not fitting into the cookie cutter standard ideal, what happens? Well, you get sent to the gulag, right? You get sent to the Holocaust, the equivalent of what Auschwitz or whatever. If you're gay, if you're a gypsy, if you're a Jew, anyone who was seen as kind of not fitting in to this cookie cutter ideal was really kind of someone who stood out and might be subject to really bad stuff. So on a later date, probably next week, we'll be looking at the Holocaust and Germany and the not rise of the Nazis. But to kind of get you started with it, I think it's really important to think about Frida Kahlo as like the antidote to that Nazi conformity, because she really is someone who, by definition, is about, no, I am who I am. I march to my own drummer. I celebrate my own self. I want my unibrow. I want my little mustache. I am happy being who I am, and my artwork is all about affirming that identity versus the picture on the right, which really speaks to a world where you're meant to not stand out. You're meant to not show any personal expression. You're meant to fit in. Literally, the women are all the same height, the same look, the same tone, the same physique. They're doing the same thing. They're wearing the same thing. And that's the kind of conformity that really leads to someone like Hitler. And I do wonder if social media has a similar kind of conformist quality that really should make you guys wary, because you don't want to live in a world that's all about conformity. You want to live in a world where your identity, your uniqueness is more valuable than you ironing out that difference so you fit in with everyone else. And it's so easy to want to iron out that difference just to kind of get the likes and to fit into this ideal that you see on the internet. And that, the masculine version of that is, soldiers and uniforms and the swastika. I mean, the swastika itself is very interesting because it's like almost like a religious symbol. It's masquerading as a religious symbol, but it's also like marching and time. But also you feel a sense of conformity. Each line of the swastika is sort of like a person, and everyone looks the same. You're just all kind of marching to the same drum. And so Frida Kahlo, I think what makes her really interesting to me from a bigger picture is how she is the opposite of, she would ne she really, even though she's not an abstract artist who Hitler